So I'm Camilla Molyneux, the Senior Researcher and Policy Advisor for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drones. And it seems like I might be chairing the first bit of this meeting because unfortunately Alan Smith is on another Zoom waiting to ask a question in the chamber, and he can't be on two Zooms at the same time because the tech doesn't allow for that. So apologies for that, but he'll be joining us later. So I'll just take us through the beginning of this event. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I think we're going to have a very interesting and informative discussion. We have got some excellent speakers coming up, and they are going to talk to us more about lethal autonomous weapon systems and the legal, ethical, and military perspectives on UK and international policy. There has been a lot of talk about lethal autonomous weapons and also autonomy in weapons lately. And for example, in the UK, when it comes to the integrated operating concept, the use of more technology in the military and by the military has been a quite important theme. And over the last decade, we have seen that there's been a lot of concerns about the development of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And there has been a lot of attention around this in the international community, with a number of states calling for them to be banned altogether. And so it's going to be a pleasure and very interesting to listen to our panel of experts who can explain more about this. So we're going to have 4 experts, and we start with Bonnie Doherty, who's a senior researcher at the Arms Division of the Human Rights Watch and also the Associate Director of Armed Conflict and Civilian Protection at Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic. She will be followed by Maya Brem, who's the legal advisor in the Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit in the Legal Division of the ICRC. Thereafter, we'll have Richard Moyes, the managing director and co-founder of Article 36. And finally, apologies, we'll have Paddy Walker first, associated fellow at RUSI, and then finally Richard Moyes of Article 36. So Bonnie, if you could start off, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and thank you very much to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for inviting me to speak today. It's really great to see so many people interested in this issue. Just to set the stage, as Camilla said, we'll be here talking about lethal autonomous weapon system, also known as LAWS, also known as fully autonomous weapons or killer robots. I'll be using all those terms interchangeably, but the term refers to systems that select or engage targets without meaningful human control. So in other words, these are systems that are the step beyond existing armed drones, where humans are out of the loop and the machine is making determinations about who to target and when to fire. The systems raise a host of ethical, legal, security, and technological concerns, and I believe Maya will be talking about some of those. So I will focus instead on addressing the current state of play of laws on the international level, making the case for a new legally binding instrument on the topic, and laying out some of the key elements of a proposed new treaty. So as some of you may know, most of the diplomatic conversations on this topic have been taking place at the Convention on Conventional Weapons meetings. That's the CCW. And it's an international treaty with attached protocols on various conventional weapons, such as landmines and blinding lasers and incendiary weapons. And CCW states parties have been holding dedicated meetings on lethal autonomous weapon systems since 2014. First, there were 3 years of informal meetings, and since 2017, there's been a more informal, what they call a group of governmental experts, or a GGE. The meetings have served as a useful incubator for developing policy positions, but there has limited concrete progress has been made. Over the course of the meetings, a vast majority of states have called for a new legally binding instrument. Some have called for a ban on fully autonomous weapons. Others have called for maintaining a requirement that there must be meaningful human control over the use of force. And essentially, these are flip sides of the same coin. The CCW, however, operates by consensus, so any one state can block. And as a result, they have not initiated negotiations on a new instrument and have only reached agreements to, quote, consider, quote, a normative and operational framework. Such a framework could refer merely to political commitments or to voluntary best practices, which we believe are insufficient to address what some people have referred to as the third revolution in warfare after gunpowder and nuclear weapons. In 2019, CCW states parties adopted a set of guiding principles, and while some states have emphasized the importance of these principles, and you may hear about them, they're simply a list of points to guide discussions, not an end in and of themselves. The next key moment is the 5-year review conference, which is currently scheduled for December 2021, although with the pandemic, that could be postponed. And it's an opportunity to for states to adopt a mandate to negotiate a protocol. But despite widespread support, this does seem like an unlikely prospect because of the consensus process I mentioned a minute ago. Therefore, to make real progress, I think states need to be prepared to go either outside of the CCW, either to an independent process or to the UNGA, and to provide a forum in which to negotiate an instrument. We believe that the plethora of concerns raised by laws necessitate a legally binding instrument for several reasons. First, a new treaty would clarify and strengthen existing international humanitarian law and establish rules that are easier to implement and enforce. While the IHL, it could also go beyond the scope in terms of IHL often focusing on the use of weapons, but this could look at development and production. And it could also be extended to address use in law enforcement operations as well as armed conflict. And finally, legally binding instrument would not only bind states parties, but would also stigmatize the system or the behavior to influence states not party or even non-state armed groups. In 2019, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots laid out a proposal for key elements of a new treaty, which I'll outline briefly here. And I want to note that there's both political support and legal or policy precedent for each of the elements I will mention. We propose a broad scope of application for a treaty. It should apply to all weapon systems that select and engage targets based on sensor processing rather than human input. And this breadth of scope is designed to ensure that nothing falls through the cracks. Whether it's a current system or an existing system, they need to be assessed, even though the restrictions are primarily focused at more future-looking systems and, as I said, weapons systems that select and engage targets without meaningful human control. The heart of the legally binding instrument should be a combination of a general obligation with prohibitions and positive obligations. So first, we have the general obligation for states to maintain meaningful human control over the use of force. It establishes a principle that would guide interpretation of the rest of the treaty and is general in order to avoid loopholes. Its focus on conduct, the use of force rather than on a specific technology, helps ensure that it's future-proof because we cannot envision all systems that would be, today we can't envision all systems that might be produced. And the reference to use of force also allows some flexibility in that it could apply to situations of armed conflict as well as law enforcement operations. The second category of obligations are prohibitions on weapon systems that, again, select or engage targets, and by their nature, rather than their manner of use, pose fundamental moral or legal problems. These we would call for prohibiting the development, production, and use of systems that are inherently unacceptable. There's two categories here. One is prohibitions on systems that would always select and engage targets without meaningful human control. So these could be systems such as those operating by machine learning, and thus are too complex for humans to understand or control. The second set of prohibitions would extend to systems that use certain kinds of data or target profiles, such as weight, heat, or sound, to represent people. And we're concerned that killing or injuring humans based on such data dehumanizes war and undermines human dignity. And it's possible that the data could even, the target profiles could be designed based on discriminatory indicators. The third category is the positive obligations, which are designed to ensure meaningful human control over all other systems that select and engage targets. And these systems may not be inherently problematic, but they might have the potential to be used without meaningful human control. So these would institute requirements that ensure, apply to a whole range of the scope that the treaty applies to, and then institute requirements to ensure that control over these systems is meaningful. And then finally, I just want to mention that meaningful human control is a concept, as you can see, that cuts across our proposal and is crucial to a new treaty. because the moral, legal, and accountability concerns raised by lethal autonomous weapon systems are largely attributable to the lack of such control. Although they may use different terminology, most states have expressed support for this general principle. And we like the term meaningful human control because control is stronger than intervention or judgment or some of the other alternatives that have been proposed. It consists of a number of components. We've distilled into 3 categories. First, there are decision-making components, which give humans the ability and information to make decisions that comply with law and ethics. So for example, people need to have an understanding, operators need to have an understanding of the operational environment. They need to understand how a system functions, and they need sufficient time for deliberation. There are technological components, which are embedded features of a system. They could include things like predictability and reliability, the ability of a system to relay information to the human, and the ability of the human to intervene in its operations after activation of the system. And finally, there's operational components, which are limits on when and where a system can operate and when it can target. So for example, here we have factors that could be constrained would include the duration of the system's operation, the time between the human's legal assessment and the system's application of force, and the nature and size of the geographic area of operation. So just in conclusion, before I hand it over, I just want to note that while I focus my remarks on the activities at the international level, the work parliamentarians are doing at the national level is critical. It will help shape UK, in your case, help shape UK foreign policy and ensure that the country maintains meaningful human control over the use of force in its operations and does not go down the path of developing new systems that would raise concerns under the principles I laid out. So I look forward to answering any questions, but now I'll pass it back to Camilla.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. That was very interesting. And I think in particular, highlighting the importance of parliamentarian action there was great. I'll hand it straight over to Maya Brem, who is with the ICRC. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Camilla. And on behalf of the ICC, I'd like to thank the APPG for drones to invite us to share our views here. And also thanks go to representatives of the campaign to stop killer robots for pulling us into this event. So thanks for that. Autonomous weapons is indeed an issue that the ICRC attaches great importance to. Over the last almost 9 years now, we've examined autonomous weapons from multiple dimensions, have put out reports and contributed to policy and expert processes on this theme. And just by way of background, the ICRC is, as you probably know, an impartial, neutral and independent organization that endeavors to prevent suffering by promoting and strengthening humanitarian law and universal humanitarian principles. And the ICRC's work on autonomous weapons and indeed other weapons is grounded in its exclusively humanitarian mission to protect the lives and dignity of victims of armed conflict and other situations of armed violence. And so from our humanitarian perspective, autonomous weapons raise a host of interesting issues and concerns. And here today, I would like to simply outline these concerns in a nutshell and focus a little bit in particular on concerns that from our perspective arise under international humanitarian law or the law of armed conflict, and then also touch upon what elements of what the ICRC recommends that states do to respond to these concerns. So from our perspective, autonomous weapons pose challenges fundamentally to human control over the use of force and weapons, and that raises serious ethical, humanitarian, and legal concerns. Now, to understand these concerns, perhaps good to recall how we understand an autonomous weapon, because as Bonnie already explained, there are different ways of approaching this issue and describing the technology or socio-technical configuration at issue. Now, for the ICRC, autonomous weapons are weapons that select and apply force to targets without human intervention. So in that sense, it is weapons that self-initiate force application in response to what they sense in their operational environment and based on a generalized target profile. Now, using weapons that function in this manner presents a humanitarian challenge. The effects of autonomous weapons use are difficult to predict, and this brings risks for the protection of civilians and other victims of war, other people who should not be targeted in war. And these humanitarian concerns are amplified with increasing reliance on artificial intelligence and especially machine learning techniques. There is also an ethical dimension, as Bonnie has already highlighted. Autonomous weapons challenge the ethical imperative to maintain human agency in decisions to kill and destroy and moral responsibility for the consequences. And then various challenges arise for the implementation and respect of international humanitarian law, in particular rules for the protection of civilians and that govern the conduct of hostilities in war. Now, I should say at the outset that international humanitarian law does not expressly prohibit autonomous weapons, but like other means of warfare, international humanitarian law regulates autonomous weapons. So autonomous weapons must be capable of being used and must in fact be used in compliance with international humanitarian law. And international humanitarian law therefore also already posits some limits on autonomous weapons. So there are some types of autonomous weapons that will fall short of these existing limits. Now, a bit more in detail then, what are some of these key rules to look at? So the most fundamental one is that, as I'm sure you're familiar with, in armed conflict, parties to armed conflict must always distinguish between civilians and civilian objects on the one hand, and combatants and military objectives on the other, and they must direct their attacks only against the latter. As a consequence, indiscriminate attacks are prohibited, indiscriminate weapons are prohibited. It is also prohibited to launch disproportionate attacks, and parties to armed conflict must take all feasible precautions in attack to avoid or at any rate minimize incidental civilian harm. Now, why do autonomous weapons raise concerns from this under these and other rules of IHL? These rules for their application call for human beings, moral agents, persons who plan and decide upon an attack to make context-specific evaluative judgments in the context of a particular attack. And these judgments, in our view, cannot be adequately substituted with machines or sensor or software functions. So, for example, to comply with the prohibition to carry out a disproportionate attack, the human weapon user, let's call that person the commander, must prospectively assess the reasonably foreseeable effects of the attack on civilians and also assess the concrete and direct military advantage that they anticipate to gain from that specific attack. Then they must weigh these dissimilar values and make a legal judgment about whether or not the expected civilian harm is excessive compared to the expected military advantage. And if it is deemed excessive, then they must not launch the attack. Now, in the present-day use of non-autonomous weapons, long-range artillery, missiles, and so on, the process of compliance with the rule of proportionality in attack is already challenging. But at least in this case, the commander chooses a specific target to attack, and therefore is easier for the commander to know whether civilians are in or in the surroundings of that target at the moment of attack. Now, by contrast, if the commander uses an autonomous weapon, they no longer select a specific target to strike. And so it becomes comparatively more difficult for the commander to to know whether, and if so, how many civilian objects are in the vicinity of an autonomous weapon strike, right? Or are then affected by it, by such a strike. And this is especially difficult in dynamic environments, for instance, in cities or similarly populated areas where civilians are present, sometimes in high numbers. And of course, with this difficulty to adequately predict the effects of autonomous weapons use, that poses challenges to commanders' ability to comply with the rules of international humanitarian law. That is, how, and so we can ask, under what conditions can a commander be reasonably certain that the effects of the attack will be such that the attack complies with IHL. Now, although, as I said, international humanitarian law clearly regulates autonomous weapons by default when they are used as a means of warfare, and also prohibits some of them, for example, inherently indiscriminate autonomous weapons, there are many questions of this sort that existing IHL does not give a clear answer to. And so to effectively protect the victims of war and to uphold the principles of humanity, the ICRC believes that internationally agreed limits are urgently needed. And without such limits, we fear that the current trends in military technology development will lead to an erosion of human control over the use of weapons. So in current practice, it appears that militaries already, in their use of weapons that function in the manner that I have described, yes, their use is relatively limited. There is tends to be under close supervision, away from populated areas. Autonomous weapons tend to operate over shorter periods of time, the smallish sort of area, and so on. And so these sorts of limits that are applied in practice today, they are there not only for ethical and humanitarian and legal reasons, but they also make sense from a military operational perspective. Now, in a paper report published last year by the ICRC and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, we sort of analyze these kinds of practices and then recommend that it is this sort of measures that are applied in present practice that should form the basis for states to agree on international limits on autonomous weapons. And among these limits, we recommend that states agree on limits on the types of targets that autonomous weapons should or may not be allowed to strike or to be programmed to strike, limits on the duration and spatial expanse of an autonomous weapons operational area, where, in what situations they may be used, and then requirements of a technical and organizational nature on their use to enable human decision makers to maintain situational awareness and the ability to deactivate the weapon. So very similar to the kinds of elements already outlined by Bonnie. Now, in conclusion, we believe that it is these sorts of limits and requirements that states should agree on, whether in the form of new rules or standards or best practice guidance. And the ICRC participates in ongoing political and expert processes to promote action towards agreements on such limits to effectively address our concerns in a timely manner. And within the limits of our mandate and expertise, we also provide guidance to all interested stakeholders, including in bilateral confidential dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. That was very interesting. We're going to jump straight over to our next speaker, Paddy Walker, Associated Fellow at RUSI.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for inviting me to your briefing. I'll probably use the acronym AWS throughout my talk. My perspective this afternoon is really only sort of like a practical, empiric lens add-on to the framework that Maya's just set out for you. And it comes from me as an erstwhile gunnery instructor in the British military, but also from doctoral PhD and postdoctoral work that I've done on the challenges to the deployment of unsupervised weapons, and really the enduring nature of these difficulties that you've heard about before in removing human supervision from lethal engagements. And first up, I would say it's absolutely not an inevitable development, all of this. Battlefield commanders, after all, have several available assets, as you'll have heard this morning in Parliament, available to complete their mission. And weapon systems are only really relevant if they're proven and reliable, and as you've heard this afternoon already, sufficiently predictable to meet a commander's obligation under his or her own received orders, but also under the laws of armed combat. So the inescapable foundation here of these weapons is that human supervision is being substituted out by an alternative means of sensing and decision-making. And these now code-based skills must, for the commander, be at least as good as human skills. So the point of my short briefing this afternoon really is to consider the technical step change that's being asked here if AWS deployment is ever to proceed, and to do this from the perspective of the battlefield commander. So let's think first about the soldier in the field, because it is currently he or she, the human operator, who signs off and is therefore responsible for the processes that comprise this lethal engagement. And this is a convoluted, very difficult context-driven endeavor. So let's just assume for a moment that all of this is one day technically feasible. Removing human oversight has several foundational ramifications for militaries. Slack times reduced, scope for leeway and initiative is removed, and any real ability for the commander to predict and influence outcomes similarly disappears. So the AWS must work first time and must work every time. To justify its deployment, those on the ground and those politicians who are listening today must be confident that the weapon will reliably perform prescribed tasks, but also do this relatively better. So whether that's cheaper, quicker, more surgically than available supervised alternatives. So let's now consider the machine learning piece behind independent weapons. Several complex capabilities, some in development, but most, I would argue, still very much marooned as research projects on a piece of paper, must be in place simultaneously and also work together seamlessly. And these really incorporate all of the routines that are needed to convert the weapon's sensed inputs into weapon actions. And this is a fundamentally fragile set of arrangements, with failure in any one piece of this likely to distort weapon outcomes. And much of this variation is because independent weapons require unrealistically consistent data and information. So partial data, noisy or indistinct data, anything that's statistically out of the ordinary, think here of simple feint or enemy surprise, fundamentally confounds autonomous processes. And none of this can be managed by code. Any error in the weapon's sensing of its current state will show up in the machine's future learning, influencing its future battlefield outcomes. An unresolved dilemma here is how one ever incorporates unlearning into an AWS routine. So the inescapable truth is that coding will invariably be constrained by earlier choices. Critical pathways for these weapons are always going to remain undiscovered, ignored, or misunderstood. And while this may work in a supervised or non-critical application, it's completely unacceptable on a battlefield. Let's just briefly consider hybrid weapons, so weapons that are part supervised, but with a bit of the weapons process being capable of independent agency. But such hybrid autonomy requires really intricate toggling of command between the human and the machine, and research universally points to erratic performance when humans are required to intervene in moments of high stress or in situations of limited information. And uncertainty, moreover, will be everywhere on the battlefield. And it's here that the commander leverages his or her human experience, judgment, and intuition. Algorithms, however, are systemically unable to match the human agent's ability to make layered decisions in a fast, frugal, and explainable manner. At these sort of higher levels of expertise, battlefield commanders don't actually recognize that they're making decisions. Rather, they're responding to changing patterns on the battlefield that they've long recognized in training in order to create proper situational awareness and an appreciation of context. Again, this cannot be coded for. A particular challenge will also arise from trying to configure these robots, and this is important for the commander. If a weapon updates on new data, which it will, then stale data, inherited or manually set thresholds, will be invalid. The more so given that each weapon will have a slightly different learning state depending on when it was deployed and it being independent, what it has learned through its machine learning. And finally, it's the practical essentials that also confound the deployment of these weapons. So, simple things like in-field replenishment, repair and servicing, managing what is after all an autonomous weapon and its polling of data. How often is it going to do this? The dynamic audit of these systems' actions and a robust means of liaison between the machine, which is autonomous, not listening to anyone, and command. The commander absolutely needs to know all of these things. So in conclusion, therefore, the fundamental leadership for commanders and also politicians is whether it can ever be appropriate to cede the decision to kill to an algorithm, and whether the local commander, who has lots of assets at his disposal, can reasonably allocate tasks within a battle plan to weapons that can't be overseen. And the question to you, I think, is whether an unsupervised weapon can really ever outperform the training and ingenuity of the human soldier, given that sophisticated electronics can actually be confounded by quite low-tech solutions. This theory of nullification, which forecasts historically quite short-lived advantage to new military technology. For me, the answer is quite clear, and it's no. Commanders and politicians at all points here must retain fundamental skepticism, I think, around AWS technical feasibility. With that, I will hand back to Camilla.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, and very much looking forward to the Q&A. But before we get there, our final speaker, Richard Moyes, Managing Director and co-founder of Article 36. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Camilla, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Moyes from Article 36. We're an NGO based here in the UK, and we specialize in weapon policy and law related issues. I think I want to take a bit of a step back with my comments and perhaps just sort of look at this issue in the sort of wider landscape. I mean, what we're talking about here, to my mind, is really how we as a society draw lines, create boundaries regarding the handing over to machines and technology, the power to kill and to harm people. So we're looking at new technologies that are being developed, new technical potentials being developed, and we're wondering, how do we as a society maintain our values and avoid a situation where we're handing over a power to machines and to computer decision making that fundamentally should remain with people. So I'm going to comment a little bit on both the policy landscape and the political dynamics as it relates to the UK government, perhaps a little bit in the context of the integrated review, which is of course very topical. We'll see some of the themes perhaps in that are relevant in this space. I mean, the United Kingdom for a number of years now has heralded itself as being a leader in how society responds to new and emerging technologies. The Prime Minister in 2019 made this a central theme of his speech to the United Nations General Assembly. Leadership on ethical AI has been another theme that we've been consistently returning to. So we as a nation seem to aspire to a position of leadership, and we certainly rhetorically articulate that goal. The Prime Minister, when he was speaking to this, noted that the UK has academic capabilities in this area, scientific, commercial capabilities, and I think this is all true. And in addition to that, we have a degree of military expertise in the United Kingdom, and we have some expertise on the setting of norms and international standards. Perhaps if we if we want to find a way to draw upon it. So we're setting ourselves up for sort of leadership in terms of how we as a society respond to technologies. But the reality of UK sort of diplomatic practice in this space is a little less inspiring. I think really there's two parts to that, and I'm going to comment on those. First of all, I would say on the positive side, quietly, I think behind the scenes, the UK has actually been moving towards a more sophisticated policy position on this issue. Initially, I think we as a nation had a rather defensive political diplomatic posture on it. We got a bit tangled up with some national level definitions that we imported into the international conversation. But over a number of years now, we've become rather more sophisticated in our thinking. And at the United Nations Convention on Conventional Weapons that I think Bonnie referred to earlier, UK statements, to my mind, bring out quite a lot that I think we could support. The UK notes that the law applies to humans, not to machines. It recognizes that autonomous systems, they are simply just machines at the end of the day. They're not moral agents and they're not legal agents. So this situating of the law as bearing on people is very important in this space. I think the UK recognizes that establishing the appropriate level of human control is the central policy requirement in this space. They recognize that's the question that we're really trying to solve. So that's fundamentally important, I think. The UK has recognized that meaningful or effective human control isn't compatible with systems that are too opaque or too inexplicable, too unpredictable. This seems quite straightforward, I think, but again, that's a significant point of agreement. We also think there needs to be a requirement of explicability and understandability in technology. And the UK, I think, also sees the exertion of meaningful human control by people in their use of technologies. It requires both an understanding of the technology itself, but also an understanding of the context in which the technology will be used. So some perhaps control over the duration of a technology's functioning or of the spatial area where it functions, and that it's this combination of both technology and context that are needed for maintaining meaningful human control in practice. So all of that, I think we would straightforwardly agree on. And this is pretty much the key elements of policy content in this area. From our side, we would like to see a sharper line drawn against the targeting of people with systems that function in this way, systems using sensors to identify targets. So we have a degree of difference from the UK on that particular point. We think this is vital for avoiding a dehumanization. But in many other respects, I think the UK's policy content these days has a lot of very positive elements to it. However, if you were to be following the international debate on this issue, you probably wouldn't have spotted or thought of the UK as a progressive leader in this space. I don't think you would really see the UK on this issue working as a leader in the development of new norms and standards. That's the kind of theme that comes up quite often in the integrated review. We talk often about ourselves as leaders towards new norms and standards. But if you actually listen to our positioning in the international debate on this issue, you see a much less ambitious role being enacted, I think. The type of policy content I've identified here is really buried under a lot of material on how existing law is completely adequate, no new rules are needed. Perhaps begrudgingly, a sort of non-binding code of conduct could be developed, but it's a far cry from the shaping the international order rhetoric that we see in documents like the Integrated Review. The Integrated Review also points to the idea of active diplomacy, especially using regulatory diplomacy to influence rules, norms, standards governing technology. Well, that's exactly what we're calling for in this space, but I've seen very little evidence that the UK is actually going to work as a leader in that direction. I suppose over the years, I've worked on 2 international legal instruments on weapons technologies and a couple of political declarations. I think a new legal instrument is urgently needed on this issue. We need to draw lines. We need to protect human dignity from this technological direction that we're working in. We need to avoid destabilizing security threats. We need to preserve existing international humanitarian law from the sort of tensions that this technology will put it under. And we actually have to believe that norms and standards in these spaces matter and that they have an effect and that they have a bearing on the wider international community. Norms and standards in these areas actually, I think, would be operationally beneficial to the United Kingdom if we could find a way to work towards them. The USA and China might not be on board such rules from the beginning, but we still need to shape the normative landscape anyway. And I think this is part of our problem, is that leadership doesn't just mean saying you're a leader or saying you're going to be a leader. It actually requires at some point actually leading, which means actually having a goal, having a sense of direction, striking a path forward and bringing other people with you. I think so far we've seen relatively little sign of the UK showing that kind of leadership in actual action. And we've seen a lot of rhetoric about leadership, which remains unfulfilled. The UK's policy position on this issue is potentially very good. It's certainly a policy position that when a political process to develop a treaty develops, the UK will not be able to stand outside that process. The UK will be pulled into a process of developing a legal instrument on this issue anyway, because our policy orientation in its detail is so congruent with where this legal instrument will likely end up, that it'll be very difficult for us to remain outside it. So really leadership remains, to my mind, the more positive political option at this point. I also suspect that there's quite a lot of foreign ministers around the world who would like to be signing a treaty protecting humanity from the threats of future technologies. I think in a lot of countries, this is the sort of thing that people become foreign ministers to do, to sign international treaties of this sort. Certainly, I would like to think that this is the sort of thing that people become foreign ministers to do. So I think really this is a clear opportunity. It's straightforwardly in line actually with the sort of things the UK says that it is in the international business to achieve. Frankly, the opportunity is just sitting there on the table if we are prepared to take it. And I think it really is a question of whether the UK is simply sort of peddling a rhetorical bluster, or whether we really do want to stand up for norms and standards in the world. Thanks, Camilla.
Thank you very much, Richard. Once again, a fascinating speech or presentation. I think Alan is about to join us, and I'd let him then speak a bit about a bill that he has submitted in Parliament. But before he joins, I think we'll just head directly to the Q&A so we can get a few questions in. So if anyone has a question, I think use either the raise hand function or just actually raise your hand and I'll be happy to give you the mic. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Tony Lloyd.
Yeah, thanks, Camilla. It's really a question specifically for Patrick, actually. Obviously, in the end, the four presentations we've heard make a very cogent and coherent case. What does this look like, though, in terms of the challenge to our own military by other military machines? If others are persuaded to use autonomous weapon systems, is the pressure on us in military terms to follow down that line? I mean, in moral terms, in international legal terms, there is a different answer. But I'd be interested to know, as a former soldier, what that looks like in terms of the driver for military, I suppose military competitive leapfrog. Thanks.
Thanks, Tony. So I gave a lecture, long lecture, sort of hour and a bit, to the graduates at Sandhurst at the Centre for Army Leadership. And all of the questions, the first questions that came up were, are we going to have a job at the end of this? Really interesting. So my premise on this, as if I had time to expand, is really I doubt the feasibility of this, being able to program for goals and values and working out how you can anchor your autonomous weapons such that when it gets new sensed information, it knows how much change to undertake in its sort of initial representation. I think these are all enduringly really difficult things. And if you're a commander with your sort of portfolio of assets, are you really going to delegate your right flank to one of these machines, or more complicated, a machine that has got some autonomous agency in it that you therefore don't understand? Because these are, machine learning is a singularly inappropriate technical spine for this. Maybe something else will come along, but you can't do it on neural networks and having various parameters, because empirically you add parameters, you change those parameters, and you'll have seen these things on the on television where you just change a tiny little bit of the training set, and instead of it being a howitzer, it presents as a giraffe or something like this, or your tank that you have programmed. So Richard was talking about signatures, target signatures in these machines. So let's paint our tanks pink, and then suddenly the target will not be understood by the machine. So I personally enduringly can't see that this is going to happen.
Thank you, Paddy. I think Alan has now arrived and is with us. If you want to jump in here.
Hi, Camilla. Thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. And apologies from me for arriving late. I was pulled into an urgent question, and with the FCDO integrated review today, it's been a bit of a day altogether. But apologies that I've missed the presentations. Roddy McGlynn he's the brains of the operation anyway, so he'll debrief me afterwards. So thank you and good to see you. And thanks, Camilla and the team, for the invitation. What I'll do in just a couple of minutes is to give an overview of the 10-minute rule bill that I've brought forward for the SNP within the Commons, which tries to do a bit of a wrapping up of a number of the strands to a lot of this stuff which we're discussing today. It's a 10-minute rule bill, so we are realistic about the likelihood of success of it as a legislative instrument. But what we are able to do with it is to bring a lot of this stuff onto the floor of the House of Commons and wider, and put that coalition together, because I think there's a number of globally significant issues at stake here. And if we don't deal with these on a globally rigorous level, then we're going to be guddling about. And as Tony Lloyd mentioned earlier there, that it could be a race to the bottom for perceived military advantage, rather than any sort of structure that allows us to maintain proper oversight and proper accountability. So the bill itself, it covers three heads. It's creating a new arms export regime for the UK. That's sending UK military equipment overseas. There is an accountability structure. The ministers do look at this stuff seriously, and I take that on face value. But there's not a lot of transparency to that. And I can say, having been an MP for a year and a half or so now, there's really not a lot of effective scrutiny within the House of Commons of that process. So we're proposing a new structure for that, modelled loosely on the ISC, in that it would not be on the wit of Parliament to come up with a scrutiny committee that would properly exercise this. I'm very drawn also to the Belgian model of doing this, where there's a much higher degree of parliamentary scrutiny of arms export. That is primarily a matter for the House of Commons, of course, but it's up to the government to ensure that that goes forward as well. On drones, we'd very much have drones as part of this accountability mechanism in terms of the rules of engagement to support the people who are having to make these decisions. I'm not against the technology in itself. I'm much more skeptical on lethal autonomous weapons, but on drones, they are decisive, and they have been decisive in a number of conflicts lately. And I'm firmly of the view that there needs to be a much higher degree of democratic oversight of their operations and accountability pre and post their use. So coming up with a better accountability mechanism, I think, is eminently proportionate. The US and Israel have got a number of ways that they do this stuff, which I think is a lot of useful examples for us to take on. Then the third head of the bill is lethal autonomous weapons. I am deeply concerned, morally, legally, ethically, on where this is going. I'd share Paddy's concern about it. I don't think they're going to be fully flying anytime soon. My worry is that we could see unscrupulous regimes using them, whether they're ready or not. And if we don't see a global discussion about accountability over these things, we could see an awful lot of outsourcing of decisions, which will have life and death consequences and will be geopolitically very, very significant. So we've put the bill forward. I'm delighted from the support that we've had from NGOs, the wider community. I would put up to all of you that it's perhaps counterintuitive that an SNP politician is bringing forward measures to strengthen scrutiny of the House of Commons. But I think this is a genuinely globally significant issue. And if global Britain's going to be about anything, if it's about bringing forward better transparency and accountability by the legislature, wherever it is, over this sort of stuff, then I will get behind that with enthusiasm. So I think there's a common agenda there for a lot of us, but look forward to the wider questions and comments, and let's keep this conversation going regardless of the bill, because Westminster being Westminster, I'm conscious it might not be the most successful piece of legislation, but we brought it forward in good faith. And I do hope that there's a number of issues there that we can give real legs to going forward. Thanks for the time.
Are there any more questions now?